We are the largest military power in the world. We've turned into that which we feared. We basically betrayed every one of our basic values for the pursuit of power and wealth. And this is because of the corrupting influence of money on demand. What this prevailing system is, under the guise of free markets, under the guise of freedom, is a system of tyranny. It's debt tyranny. It's slavery using money.
Hey friends, welcome back. I am very excited to have you and my guest, Darryl Schoon. It's been far too long. We spoke with Darryl a few years ago after he had released his book called Time of the Vulture, How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process. Darryl's YouTube channel is Schoon Works, and I just watched a very fascinating conversation between Darryl and author Ralph Terry Foster about Foster's book, Fiat Paper Money. Boy, was that an interesting conversation. Darryl, how are you? Welcome back.
Fine, thanks. Good to be here, Sean.
Well, it's so nice to have you, Darryl. And as you noted in that video conversation between you and Ralph Terry Foster, you say, caught between deflation and hyperinflation, paper money's demise is certain. In its 1,000-year history, no paper money has survived. I loved watching that conversation between you two, Darryl, and I reached out to you and I said, you know what, you and I have to talk again. We need to get your perspective on where we're at as the Fed says, hey, we might need another $4 trillion to stem an economic crisis, another economic hurricane, but then everything will be fine. Darryl, the Fed's out of control, central banks are out of control. What's your perspective? Where do we stand?
Sean, the way I look at it, let's say we were a team of monetary pathologists. All right, we're like doctors, and we're looking at a patient. All right, and what's going on with the patient? Well, this patient is a system of credit and debt. All right, this is what capitalism is. It was credit and debt. Started in 1694 when the bankers, they weren't even called bankers before this happened. They were money lenders, but the bankers came and they approached King William. He had huge war debts. And they said, listen, we'll pay off your war debts if you allow us to circulate bills of it. No, he said, if we could issue bills of exchange. They didn't even say circulate, all right? And all he heard was probably, hey, you can pay off my war debts. So that he chartered the Bank of England. This is 1694. They then paid off his war debts and began circulating bills of exchange in the form of money. The original charter never gave the Bank of England the right to issue money. It gave them the right to issue bills of exchange, but not to circulate them as money. Well, they just went off to the races. He got his money to fight his wars. He was happy, and therefore, this is what the bankers got in power. And it was eventually called capitalism. It's capital, the substitution of a debt-based money for savings-based money. This is really what capitalism is. It piggybacks free markets. It'll piggyback anything. All right, free markets are the most efficient way to operate markets, and therefore the parasite went to town on a free market economy. Mm-hmm. What you're seeing here is we're looking at what I would call a system that's in its last stages. Yeah. In its early stages, the credit is pushed into a system. It creates new jobs, new opportunities. Things are good. Loans are repaid, and everything is hunky-dory. Mm-hmm. All right? Mm-hmm. But at the end of a system of credit and debt, there's far too much debt, all right? And no amount of credit can ever induce enough economic activity to pay down that debt. This is where we are in 2016. This whole system really started falling apart, and this is where Ralph and I had our conversation about fiat paper money, because when they withdrew the gold back into the U.S. dollar, this allowed banks and governments to print as much money as they wanted to. And see, what people don't realize before, they realize in a very vague way that somehow gold gave paper money its value, which it did. But in a more important way, Sean, it limited the ability of governments to print as much money as they wanted. Why? Because at that time, they still had to exchange gold or dollars for negative trade balances, all right? And so, in other words, if country A bought a lot more than it produced, country A would have to exchange currency backed by gold or backed by the dollar at that time, because the dollar was backed by gold. It would have to give other countries, it was liable for its negative trade balance. So ultimately, gold was the arbiter, all right? The U.S. dollar was the only currency fully convertible to gold. Everybody else after 1945 connected to the U.S. dollar, and that's how we had a stable economy.
Right.
In 1971, we yanked the dollar off the gold standard. The reason was this: 1949, the United States had, I think, 29,000 or 24,750 metric tons of gold, the largest amount of gold on the earth. And the only way this gold moved around was to balance trade deficits, which I had touched on previously. The only way. Nobody else. You and I couldn't even buy it at the time. All right. It was legal for Americans to own gold after 1933. But gold was still used in the international monetary system, backing the U.S. dollar to settle trade balances. This is how it got kept in balance. Well, what happened is after World War II, the United States went on a permanent war footing. All right. And we had bases all over the world. So we were paying them in U.S. dollars. And all of a sudden, gold started draining out of the U.S. Treasury.
Well, and let me add that we're still on a permanent war footing. We never got off the war footing.
No,
we're
we
a
never got off.
war-based economy and have been for decades.
This is a point that we might want to touch on here, Sean.
Well, and let me just say, you mentioned 1971. When Nixon took us off the gold standard, we suffered massive inflation from 71 to 1980, which you noted in that video. Guys, I should mention the name of that video. That conversation between Ralph Terry Foster and Darryl was called "It's Not About Gold, It's All About Gold." And I have a story I want to share with you in a second to demonstrate the truth of that. But let's get back to this inflation. The massive inflation we saw between 71 and 80 was only stemmed by Volcker taking action and cranking interest rates up over 20%. Can you even imagine, Darryl, if they tried to do that today? They couldn't crank rates up to 7% or 5%.
No, you couldn't. You can't even. If you raise the rates today, we're what 0.50.
Yeah, okay. No, it's game over. If they went to 3%, it's game over.
Yeah, it would. This shows where we are. Okay, like as I was saying, we went back to the metaphor of monetary pathologist. What we would know is that the patient is so vulnerable and so fragile that if we did what we did 15 years ago or 20 years ago to save his life, he would die.
No, the U.S. dollar is like Hillary Clinton right now. It's got a hacking cough that will not end, and the Fed is trying to say it's just pneumonia. Meanwhile, the real doctors are saying, no, it's Parkinson's. It's terminal.
Yes, but nobody wants to say it because the system is based on confidence. The system of credit and debt is really based upon, and this is why confidence is so high. This is the way they measure it. All right, because the more confident people are, the more they're willing to mortgage their future.
That's right.
To pay off those debts. I wrote one of my early articles, Sean. It was called "Selling Dreams on Credit." Make a fortune by selling dreams on credit. This is what bankers have done. When they started, the only entities that they would give credit to, one, were governments. This is basically the Ponzi scheme started in England. So the only entity that they loaned money to was the government. Why? Because the government could tax people to pay them back.
That's right.
Right. And in fact, when they did this, Sean, there was not even national taxation. National taxation as a concept emerged after the Napoleonic Wars when England owed so much money. I mean, that drained them. That they passed a tax, a national income tax, and they said, of course, it was going to last for 10 years till they paid it off, and of course, it didn't. But that was in the 1700s. So this stuff it builds on itself. It started out with loaning money to the King of England so he could fight his wars. Now, everybody can go to war on credit. That's what people don't realize, where imperialism came from. England was the only country that could go to war on credit at that time.
Well, that's right. And it was Rothschild's mother who said, if it weren't for my sons, if my sons didn't want there to be wars, there would be no wars, because they financed the wars. And they knew and they knew that the best way to indebt nations was to get nations to go to war and then finance both sides. This insidious beast system must be stopped. It must be brought to an end. And we can talk about the ways that might happen here in the future, because a lot of us think that the powers that be, the Western powers that be, the Rothschild, Rockefeller banking cartel is losing control. We can get your opinion on that in a second, but let me just say this. As we talk about the death of the dollar, or the U.S. dollar being in its terminal phase, I want to put up this chart from SRS Rocco, guys, which shows the exponential growth of debt in the United States. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be stymied. And ultimately, it spells our doom. Now, I want to share this story with you, Darryl.
Okay.
I think this is interesting. I think this is sort of funny, and it'll help everyone understand exactly how inflation is the enemy of all of us, and even the smartest people out there still don't understand it. So I listened to this Adam Carolla podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but Adam, Dr. Drew actually just got fired for speaking truth about Hillary's health. Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew do a show together. Carolla has actually the #1 podcast in the world, and he's really into cars, collectible cars.
Okay.
And he's got a whole fleet of collectible cars, which he just decided to sell because he fell in love with this very rare, one-of-a-kind Paul Newman racing car. So he sold all his cars, and he bought this car for $4.5–5 million. And he was telling the story about how he knows that car will be worth far more in the future because, for instance, just 15 years ago, a very rare Ferrari sold for $14 or $15 million, and today it's worth $30 to $40 million.
Yeah.
And he cited all of these examples. But what he doesn't understand is what he's describing with that now $40 million Ferrari is the loss of the purchasing power of dollars because if that person who had bought the $15 million Ferrari 15 years ago had instead bought gold, that gold today would be worth more than $60 million.
You're right. Now, Ralph Terry Foster, the guy I was talking with in my interview, he's a great guy. He really is, and he's a coin dealer out of Berkeley, and he wrote this book. In fact, what he did, it was rather brilliant.
And it's called Fiat Paper Money, right?
Fiat. This is the only real history of fiat paper money that's out there. Mm-hmm. I mean, and he was living in Berkeley. He's got a store in Berkeley, and he hired all these graduate students. The kind that toil for professors trying to get their PhD. These are the top brains in the country. And he paid them more than they're probably paid by the university, which keeps on slave labor. All right. And he had all these people research different countries. And then he put it together in this book called The History of Fiat Paper Money. And what he was talking about was, in the book, he doesn't talk about, he talks about paper money and not a lot about gold. But as he pointed out in the interview, that it's the most referenced word in the book. Why? Because when paper money collapses, and it collapses because its store of value is zero at that point, people rush to real value. And in monetary terms, it's always been gold or silver. All right. And in fact, one of the really curious things is, and I think this is really germane today, is that we're approaching the 1,000-year history of birthday of paper money. And it started in China in 1024, which is where we're at 16, so we're 8 years off of the 1,000-year anniversary of paper money. And the government didn't do it. It started because they ran out of copper, which was their copper coins, and somebody had the bright idea that, well, we're out of copper. Why don't we use lead? All right. So they started minting coins out of lead. Well, the value between lead and copper was so great that it took a lot of lead to buy anything. It took, if you're going to buy salt, which everybody bought at that time, the amount of lead coins that you'd have to do was too heavy to carry around. So what people started doing is they started depositing these lead coins at money shops, because there were money shops at that time in China. All right, they facilitated commerce. All right, and so they would give the guy in the money shop would give them a receipt, let's say, for how many strings of lead coins that they had. Then what people would start doing is trading these receipts around as money, because they knew they would theoretically go to the coin shop and pick up those lead coins. Well, nobody went to the coin shops, all right, because it was so much easier. This happened really quickly in Sichuan, all right, back in probably 1018, started 1018.
Well, and the same thing's happening today. Kyle Bass tells the story of what's going on at the COMEX, and when he talked to the head of deliveries at the COMEX, and he talked about, well, what if just 4% of the people show up and demand delivery of their gold? And the head of the COMEX said, well, Kyle, that never happens. And Kyle said, well, what if it does? And the guy responded,
we rarely ever get a 1% delivery. So, and I said, well, what if it does happen? And he says, well, price will solve everything. I said, thanks, give me the gold.
Give me the gold. I'll take my gold.
Yeah. Price will take it. It'll go through the roof.
Yeah.
It'll destroy everything.
Yeah.
That's the cheapest. But people have to come up with an answer, Sean. Because this man, he's just trying to hold his system. He wants his job. All right. And he knows that there's nothing there, but the system seems to be working. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a fractional reserve system. But what Ralph's book shows is that it's been tried and tried again throughout history. The Chinese had 500 years of this. 500 years. Five dynasties went down. They ate it. Mm-hmm. Governments went down, and every time it was back to gold and silver. In fact, what happened was this.
Well, let me say one thing. You mentioned China. Who is the biggest hoarder, actually, of gold at this point on the planet? China. They know exactly where this is going. And I want to ask you about SDRs in a second, but I interrupted. Go ahead.
So what happened is after 500 years of this, I mean, even they had enough. All right? 500, that's a long time. All right? And it was chaos, just total chaos. So the last dynasty that rolled into it, the Qin dynasty, which is the one that the British forced to take opium because they wouldn't take their paper money. Mm-hmm. All right. They said they outlawed paper money. 1661. They said no more, no more, no more. Okay. And they didn't need paper money. And what had happened in China, which was really fascinating, was that the state did not issue money. All right. Because you talked about silver. What was circulating in China as currency was pure silver. Pure silver. And what happened was that when the Brits went over there, here they were loaded with paper money because they had invented it. All right. And now they were fat and they wanted what money bought, which they wanted was tea out of China, silks out of China, and porcelains out of China. So they rolled into China and said, here, we want this stuff. And Chinese go, great, you can take it. What are you going to give us? We want silver. And the British go, no, we were going to pay you this money. Well, the Chinese had 500 years of experience with this damn money, and they said, we won't take it. So the Brits had to give them silver, the biggest dump of silver in the history. Most of the silver was mined in Americas by the Spaniards. It ended up in China because the British had to pay real silver for what they wanted, and then they said, hey, we're going broke. And then they had the Opium Wars in 1840, 1860, forced China to take opium, balanced out with opium from India, and everything was well, except China was now addicted to opium. All right? But what was curious about it, what was happening in China at this time, money was not circulating either as paper or issued by the government. It was silver. Silver taels, they call them TAELs. And it was just, they knew it. They could melt it down. It was like this, it's circulating. So it wasn't even a government issued thing. And the thing worked. But anyway, what we're here now is we're back at the end of a system that's failing. It served us. You can't even say served. It did serve us. It served the function. It certainly brought a huge standard of living to the world that had never been before. And now at the end of this Ponzi scheme of credit and debt, we're on the same page. China, us, Russia, the French, we're all on the same page, and we weren't before it started. England took the money, ran their little imperialist game. We all sort of speak English. And now we're all in the same boat, and the boat's got a hole in it. Right. The Chinese are over there with their own hole. All right, the Russians are over there with their own hole. The Ecuador, everybody's in the same boat, and the boat's sinking. And we each have a hole because the boat is now lined with paper money for the first time in history. The whole world is on paper money. What Ralph's book pointed out was no system of paper money has ever survived. What my friend Antal Fekete is incredibly brilliant, he was brilliant. And he said the benefit of the 30s is that when we went down and had the Depression before is that there was countries still on the gold standard that had relative stability. All right. Now, after that, no one is on the gold standard. This is the first time in history, Sean, that every country's been on paper money. So you confront that with the history of paper money, which is inevitably, it reverts to the mean, which is zero. Mm-hmm. And it reverts to the mean after huge monetary inflation and money printing. That's where we are. Now, here we are in 2016. We happen to be, and this is after thinking about it. I saw this coming I saw this coming in the 1990s when I started looking at it. And of course I go, holy shit, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to us? And I saw how the dollar was vulnerable. What I think is going to happen is this. The dollar is going to be the last man standing. All right? I mean, I thought because we were the most vulnerable, we had a negative trade balance, people were going to move around. The truth is, there's no alternative to the dollar except precious metals. And the bankers are not going to allow precious metals into the game. They're going to do everything they can because it really is a threat to their whole Ponzi scheme of credit and debt. So those of us who know about it are the only ones who are going to ride that one out. The rest of them, everybody else is going to be, they can't do it. They're not going to go there. But the dollar is going to be the last piece of paper standing. And when it goes, everything's going.
Yeah.
Now,
go ahead.
We talked about the SDRs. They're trying to roll that into it.
Well, let's talk about. Well, I want to go to the SDRs in a second. Let me just say one thing, though. You say the dollar will be the last man standing. Of course, when the Titanic went down, there was a last man standing. There had to be one last guy before his body hit the Atlantic.
And we don't know who he is, but he does.
Yeah. And he didn't make it, so the dollar's not going to make it. And I do want to talk about China moving to SDRs or agreeing to exchange treasuries for SDRs. This is information that's just been reported over the past month. It's a big story. I want to get your opinion on it. But I also want to say this. Again, as we talk about the dollar losing value, I don't think there's a better example of it than that Ferrari example. A $15 million Ferrari now worth $30 million. The same amount of gold is now worth $65 or $70 million, certainly north of $60 million. And you wrote in your book, when stocks lose their value, that's a terrible thing. When real estate loses its value, that's a terrible thing. When money loses its value, that's the most terrible thing of all. Because it never recovers. And that's where we're headed. Look no further than what's going on in Venezuela. It's an absolute crisis. It's a human crisis. And ultimately, I think if the bankers have their way, if they're allowed to have their way, Darryl, they're going to do that same thing to us. You say the dollar will be the last man standing. That doesn't mean Americans are going to be wealthy. People holding fiat are doomed.
Well, what they're doing, see, a parasite. Banking is a parasite. It's a parasitoid, okay? And what eventually happens is they even kill their host. They can't stop it. It's not like they have an inbuilt system that goes, holy smokes, we got to keep... The British had a sense of stability about it. They really did. The British understood the beast that had given them their empire. They really did. I mean, looking back at the history of banking and capitalism, the Brits understood the golden goose. All right? They ran it as long as it could go. They started with a very small economy, a little island off the coast of Europe, made it into a worldwide empire. The sun never shone on, never set on the British Empire 200 years later. Well, the thing with capitalism, capital markets, it has to keep growing. If it doesn't grow, it implodes. Growth, they have to. It's the devil's whip. Why? Because debt compounds. And if the compounding debt is not repaid, the system collapses. So what happened is England empire reached its limit in the late 1800s, couldn't grow anymore, so they switched the game over to the United States, all right, which had fought central banking. That's why one of the reasons the American Revolution was fought. Thomas Jefferson said that bankers are a bigger threat to our well-being than a standing army, and he really didn't trust the military at all. All right, but what happened is that the Brits, the bankers, the British, they understood this beast that had given them the power that they had. They were walking around in puffed wigs and living the good life. All right, and you can say capitalism works. Well, you talk about all the countries that have sucked the money out of. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-lose game. It really is. It's a win-lose game, all right? And the bankers are the only ones left standing at the end, but there will be an end, and that's what we're approaching. The difference between me and a lot of people looking at this, Sean, is that I don't, I've been my whole life has been so strange that I watch it mainly as an observer at this point, especially with my age, and so I don't have so much that vested interest, that skin in the game. I got skin in the game. I mean, we're all here at this time. But the truth is, the system is collapsing. The bankers are going to be the only one left, but they're like that parasite that doesn't know when to stop. And they basically killed the greatest beast they had. They moved from England to the United States in 1913. All right? They sent us on a great debt spree. The United States before 1913 was basically isolationist. And who calls them isolationists? You can call us isolationists because we didn't want to meddle in other countries' affairs. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said, why would you want to dominate another person? All right? But what happened is 1913, they gave us carte blanche to print our own money. And now, 100 years later, we are the largest military power in the world. We've turned into we've turned into that which we feared. All right. We basically betrayed every one of our basic values for the pursuit of power and wealth. All right. And this is because of the corrupting influence of money on demand. And, you know, what was his name? Ludwig von Mises wrote a book, and he's why most people know about Austrian economics now. He wrote a book in 1949 called Human Action. And what he drew back was, in that book, he said, economists like to think that economics has nothing to do with us, that is a system unto itself, sort of like the solar system. It's not true. It's totally about us. Money is about us. Economics is about us. And what we have found out is it's not the system, it's us. It's our greed, it's our hatred, it's our tendency to dominate others, take advantage of others if given the chance. And really what paper money did is it opened the Pandora's box of human nature. All right? I mean, and it's gotten pretty ugly. I mean, if you look at our planet now, Sean, it's really a tragedy. It really is a tragedy. It's gotten really ugly.
Well,
right?
I've said a long time now, I've been saying for a very long time, Darryl, that if we had a group of benevolent dictators, because what we have is really essentially malevolent dictators headed by the IMF, the World Bank, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. These central bankers are essentially dictators, and they're very malevolent. They hate humanity. They want it all for themselves. If they were benevolent, they could have used these printing presses.
This could be paradise.
This could be paradise. It could be
everyone.
Eden. There's plenty of resources on this planet for it to be an Eden.
For everyone.
That's
but
right.
You see, the system has no constraint.
But
Why?
but the system,
human nature has no constraint.
But the system is evil. Again, these people are malevolent. They use their funny money printing presses to enslave humanity, not to free humanity. So we can't blame humanity for what these bankers have done to us.
It's a system. In fact, what you just said, it's really, Sean, you said something that's really interesting. It's a system. Edwards Deming, he was the man who transformed Japan after World War II. I mean, made in Japan was like a pejorative comment. I mean, it was like a joke. This guy, he was an American physicist. He went to Japan. The Japanese knew that they had to change, all right, because they were just toast after World War II, literally, all right? So they knew they had to export, and they knew their exports had a reputation that was deservedly bad. So they brought this guy over. He was already over there during the census. It was just like, fake Dharma in a way. His name was Edwards Deming. And Deming was a physicist, all right? So he was very objective, very rational, and he said, he says, it's a system. He said, you can blame people for what happens, but the system determines what happens. And he said, this is as true for people as it is for products. And so he showed how if you change the system, you could have extraordinary products coming out the other end. This catapulted Japan to world power in 20 years, all right? And what he said was this. It's the system that is fault. It's never the people. It's always a system. And that's what you said. What the system is, what this prevailing system is, under the guise of free markets, under the guise of freedom, is a system of tyranny. It's debt tyranny. All right? It's slavery using money. And this is really what we're up against. Now, we've got a lot of people self-identified with the system because it gave us so much before. Things are happening so fast that those who have benefited by it, and unfortunately, we've had this explosion of credit after 1971 that made everybody think things were hunky-dory.
Yeah, well, let me say one thing here, too, because I'm very, very hopeful. I ride the tide between hope and despair, and right now I'm very hopeful because listen to this. Do you remember the big awakening, the worldwide awakening, the paradigm shift that was supposed to happen in 2012? Remember hearing all about that?
Yeah.
It may be happening because, look, Hillary Clinton is falling apart at the seams. Everybody in the world with two brain cells to rub together knows how corrupt she and her husband is. They know who she represents. She's a Rothschild puppet. She benefited from $100,000 per head fundraisers from Lady Rothschild and the Rothschild family. She is a puppet of these banksters. She is spiritually sick. She is physically sick. She's falling apart at the seams. And, against that backdrop, we have Brexit. We have people standing up and saying, no, we want out of the EU. We want out. We don't want to be a part of this system anymore. We don't want to be part of your central banking schemes. We don't want anything to do with this. And I think humanity's waking up. But, and I think this is a good bridge over to the SDR question, as you know, Darryl, and I cite often, the Rothschilds' 1988 cover of The Economist magazine predicted a world currency in 2018. Here we sit on the cusp as we barrel towards 2018, and we have the IMF's Christine Lagarde going over to China with the first step toward a one world currency with China's SDR bond issue.
Yes.
And it needs to be talked about. Let me just read this from Epoch Times. They promised, they delivered. The World Bank will issue a $2.8 billion SDR bond, or special drawing rights bond, in China in August. Separately, the China Development Bank will also issue between $300 million and $800 million of SDR notes. China, the International Monetary Fund, and interested think tanks have been pushing the idea of private SDR since the beginning of the year. It has now come to fruition. But what does it actually mean? Before I get your response, Darryl, I just want to say this. Against the backdrop of that news, we have Zero Hedge reporting that IMF's Lagarde slams globalization, warns of groundswell of discontent. She says, and I quote, "Growing inequality in wealth, income, and opportunity in many countries has added to a groundswell of discontent, especially in the industrialized world. A growing sense among some citizens that they lack control, that the system is somehow against them. Financial institutions are being seen as unaccountable to society. Corruption remains endemic," end quote. So here, on one side of her mouth, she says there's a groundswell of discontent against globalization. Meanwhile, she's moving towards a global one world currency with China's cooperation. Are they going to get what they want and what the Rothschilds predicted they'll get in 2018?
Now, let's back up and talk about the Rothschilds. They weren't part of that cabal that approached King William in 1694, but they followed soon after, Mayor Rothschild and his kids. They're very brilliant, all right? And what they did was in England, because England was the seat of this Ponzi scheme, they controlled the royal mint. That was their first thing, all right? The Rothschilds controlled the royal mint, so they minted the gold and silver that was coming out of England at the time. What the Rothschilds then did was they syndicated loans. They were the first people to syndicate loans. And this was for England's war efforts. Then they syndicated the loans on behalf of the French. Because why did they syndicate loans to governments? For war, because basically governments were going to war with each other. They needed money. These guys printed it out of thin air, all right, and could do it and make money off both sides of the table, which they did, all right. Now, what happened is their system is imploding. Okay, the Rothschilds had probably taken more gold off the table than anybody else. All right, and in the early 1970s, when as gold started moving up, they made this big statement in London: to gold has no value, which is, they were trying to pull off a repeat of the story of when Mayor Rothschild cheated. Found out that Waterloo had, in advance and shorted the market or took advantage of either way and made a fortune. So they're trying to do the same thing. Well, we're getting to the point of where the bankers are really concerned about their system. Now, what we don't realize from our vantage point, Sean, is that we know we're not in control. I mean, it's clear we're not in control. And I want to tell you that and there's a mentality that is prevalent among the powerless, that somebody's doing it to them. And the truth is, it is being done to us. There are more powerful entities at work here. But the truth is, they are not in control either, and they know it. One of my sayings, Sean, is this: credit is no more money than power is control. All right? But people who have credit really think it's money. You got to pay it back, but they think, oh, I got money. No, you got to pay it back. And people who have power, it leads them to think they're in control. They don't. They have power. It's not the same as control. The boys at the top, the elites, all right, the Rothschilds, the banking interests, the minions who work for them, have more power than the rest of us, temporal power right now in this place there. The truth of the matter is, they know in their heart of hearts that this is in control, and that's why they're getting scared. All right, and they see what's happening. All right, how cognizant are they of the roles that they play? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. All we can do is watch them and see what they're doing. Now, let's talk about the move towards the SDRs. Okay, they know that their system is faltering. I mean, negative interest rates. I mean, if we go back to the metaphor of monetary pathologists, to see a negative interest rate is a definite sign of systemic distress. The patient's going to die. All right. Credit, the cost of credit is the heart of the capital system. All right. The cost of credit. And it's never been negative before in the history of anything. 5,000 years. We've never had negative credit until 2 years ago. And now it's spreading like wildfire. This is a sign of how deeply distressed the system is. These boys are watching it. They also know that pulling gold out of the system destabilizes the system because money is going. So they come up with this idea called SDRs. They were going to have a basket. Well, the SDRs were first floated in the 1970s. All right, after they withdrew gold from the system, SDRs, special drawing rights in the IMF, and it didn't work. It didn't work. All right, and this is what I want to put out there. All right, is that we're watching people who are far more powerful than us. All right, who are, I mean, it's like Napoleon. Napoleon really thought he was going to get to Moscow. In fact, when he started his campaign to get to Moscow, he thought he was going to get there. So did Hitler. All right, both of them never made it. All right, it's what they call the darkest before the dawn or brightest before the collapse. We are watching the end of the system. It is very clear that, well, the Chinese are playing two hands at the time.
Yeah,
all right,
I agree with that.
They are. They're not dumb, but they're caught in the game. They had to go paper money. I mean, paper money allowed them to get where they were because what happened is that we sent all our jobs to China, and China joined the game at the end.
Look, I was listening to a very interesting conversation between Max Kaiser and Dan Collins of China Money Report. And guys, you should go watch this interview. It's Kaiser Report, episode 963. It's called "Will the Dollar Live to Die Another Day?" And Dan Collins was saying, look, the reason the Chinese don't want to be the new world's reserve currency is they know that means they have to inflate. They have to be massive debtor to the world, and they don't want to do that. So,
well, you instead, see, I saw that video.
But instead, let me just say, instead, just so the audience knows, instead they've agreed to participate in this SDR basket and get out of treasuries. And Dan Collins and Max Kaiser make the point that with this new SDR system, it could allow the World Bank and the IMF to soak up $100 trillion in central bank debt, allowing this Ponzi to go on much longer than any of us thought it could possibly.
Yeah. You know, your statement is really interesting. In 1986, I met Howard Hughes' former banker, and he was an extraordinary guy. And we were walking along, and I had no concept of banking at the time. I mean, it really was. Okay, and I remember what he said. He said, "You know, we're going to need something. We're going to need something to roll this thing forward." He was a banker, a pure banker, all right, and clearly he was part of the system. He was Howard Hughes, and he was you know, and I had no idea what he was talking about at the time. But you know, as I became interested in this game, I realized he saw then in the mid '80s what they're having to do now. It's always been a thing. Hyman Minsky pointed it out that in the early days of capitalism, credit goes out there, creates economic opportunity. Loans get made, debts get repaid, debts get retired, and more credit is issued. Once you reach what he calls an overly mature capitalist system, you've got too much debt for credit, all right? And so the debts aren't being repaid, they're being rolled forward, all right? They're being banked up, and they're printing more money to roll it forward. What SDRs are is the latest attempt by the paper boys to roll it forward,
right?
Okay?
That's right. Now,
this is a very interesting question. Will the dollar live to die another day? It may or may not. All right. I know what their intent is. I have no doubt. You know, I'm so cynical about human nature, but I'm really positive, like you are, Sean, and how this game's going to turn out. All right. But nothing humanity does really shocks me. I mean, we're just a sad example of what we managed to do. And maybe it's not our own fault, but really our track record is not well what we've done with the planet here. All right. But I think other forces are afoot. And the boys who are behind the money game, the paper money game, are truly evil. And what evil means is that they don't care about other people. They only care about, they're like a parasite that wants more. And when a parasite wants more, it's ultimately going to kill its host. All right? And it doesn't even know it. It's blind to its own demise. And I'm sure, one of the things about human nature, Sean, it isn't our virtues that are going to get us. It's our failings. All right? And what we keep trying to do is keep pushing what we're good at. All right? Hoping it's going to cover up what we're crappy at. All right? But in the end, it's what you're crappy at that's going to get you. Okay? And that's what the parasites don't understand, is that they need a system with which to work. They need to feed off something. And they pushed it to the point where they killed it. They have pushed it to the point where they have killed the beast off which they fed. All right? Money is only circulating among themselves. One of the metrics I watch is the velocity of money. And when every recession has ended before this one, the velocity of money picked up again. All right? This recession was declared over in 2009. Unlike every previous recession, the velocity of money has continued to fall. And this is the reason why is that the recession is not really over. Now, the metrics that they measure recession by is economic expansion says it's over. Well, that's because they got a shot of steroids, which was QE. Right. They got a massive shot of steroids, which jolted the dying body. You had it circulating again, and so they go, the recession's over. Well, the truth of the matter is, watching that little blip, 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 blip on the chart of the economy, the velocity of money has continued to fall. The only place where the velocity of money has continued to expand is among the very wealthy, who have still huge amounts of money, huge amounts of credit, and they're bidding against each other for the same thing. So what they're looking for, cars,
$30 million Ferraris, right?
Absolutely, $1 billion Ferraris, and they're happy. The rest of the people, they're dying. They're absolutely dying. I mean, they're dying. All right, and those who haven't died yet are looking the other way, hoping that somehow fate's going to bail them out. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know if the SDRs are going to work. My initial feeling is they're not going to, because I knew it didn't work the first time they floated out. I think it's just another desperate measure of a dying system. It's not going to work it's not going to be any more successful, Sean, than the Japanese have been successful about saving their economy from deflation that started in 1990.
Well,
right?
Right. Well, I agree with you. And one thing I just want to say is, regardless of whether or not the SDR basket works in the short term or the long term or for any period of time at all, we know that gold is going to play a part in the system, because China will not turn its back on gold. It will continue to acquire gold, hoard gold, save gold, and stay out of debt. Again, they don't want to be the world's reserve currency because they don't want to flood the world with yuan. They don't want to be debtors to these central banks. They're too smart. They've been playing this game for centuries. Centuries, literally centuries.
Well,
And let me just say one thing before we turn it back to you as we wrap up here in the next couple of minutes. I love your passion. We have to get you back on in the next few months. We should make you a regular guest, because I just absolutely love your passion. This has been a super fun conversation for me. I want to thank you for your time, and I just want to say we got to revisit this thing in 15 years and see if Adam Carolla's $4.5 million car is worth $9 million. Let's say he's right, and it's worth $9 million. The question, Darryl, is, what will gold be worth? What will the same $4.5 million, had he invested it in gold, what will that be worth in 15 years? I suspect it'll be worth far more than $9 million.
Yeah, the last bet's on the table, Sean. It's on the table. And the roulette, the wheel, it's spun, the ball is bouncing around. We're just waiting to see where it's going to end up.
Yeah, that's right. Darryl, I just absolutely love your passion. Thanks so much for joining us today. Remind people of your YouTube channel name. Let's get you some more subscribers.
It's called Schoonworks.
And that's
SCHOONWORKS.
Excellent. Excellent. I'll put the link below. And the name of your book
is Time of the Vulture: How to Profit, from the Crisis. But I'm writing another book, and this is where, and it's sort of going. It's going to answer the questions that you had. It may not answer them, Sean, but it's going to address the questions that you brought up today.
And do you have a title for that book yet?
The Crises in the Context.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, guys, our guest has been Darryl Schoon. You can subscribe to his excellent YouTube channel at Schoon Works on YouTube. And Darryl, I want to thank you very much for your time. This has been very enlightening and a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. It gives me goosebumps to have conversations like this with like-minded, passionate people. So many of us now are like-minded and passionate, and this system is dying. Hillary Clinton is the prime example of that. She represents the system. She's literally dying. Their system is dying. We are winning. I swear to you, we're winning. Humanity is rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. Visit us at sgtreport.com 24 hours a day for real news. That's what we focus on. That's our goal, is to provide you with real news and information, the antidote to the corporate trash propaganda they shove down your throats at CNN, MSNBC, ABC. The Mockingbirds are losing. We're winning. Thanks for watching. God bless.